He screamed, "I want a divorce." But 3 years later, his ex-wife was flying business class with their daughter, and a secret that would change everything. Ethan's voice tore through the marble halls like a thunderclap. "I want a divorce." The words echoed, sharp and final, leaving the air heavy with something colder than anger. Sophia stood by the window, holding little Lily close to her chest. She didn't cry, didn't plead. Her silence unsettled him more than any argument could. The late afternoon light poured through the tall glass panes, falling across his perfect suit and her tired face, two people who no longer recognized each other. He had once loved her deeply, or at least he thought he had. But the past year had turned him into a stranger: sleepless nights, endless meetings, numbers that stopped making sense, and a company slipping through his fingers. The pressure twisted him into someone he hated. Sophia, with her quiet strength, had become a mirror of everything he wasn't anymore. And he couldn't bear it. So he shouted, not because he wanted freedom, but because he needed to hurt someone before the world hurt him again. Sophia felt the floor vanish beneath her, yet she didn't move. She watched him pace the room, golden hair disheveled, blue eyes wild. This was not the man who once promised her a lifetime of sunsets and laughter. This was someone fighting ghosts only he could see. She wanted to reach him, to remind him who they used to be, but she knew it was too late. "Take whatever you want," he said finally, exhausted, running a trembling hand through his hair. "Just go." The word came out barely audible, but she heard it as clearly as if he had screamed again. She looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with a quiet, heartbreaking clarity, and nodded. That night, while the mansion slept, Sophia packed a single suitcase. She took Lily's favorite stuffed bunny, her sketchbook, and nothing else. The driver who had once taken her to charity galas now drove her to the bus station without saying a word. Rain tapped against the windows, and in its rhythm, she found the strength not to cry. When dawn broke, the bus rolled out of the city. Sophia held her daughter close as skyscrapers gave way to empty fields. She didn't know where she was going, or how she would survive. All she knew was that love had died in that house long before Ethan's words, and that somewhere beyond the horizon waited a chance, not for revenge, not for riches, but for peace. For Ethan, it was the end of a chapter he thought he controlled. For Sophia, it was the beginning of the life she would build from the ashes. The apartment above the bar was barely large enough for a bed, a crib, and a table that tilted slightly to one side, but to Sophia it was a beginning, a space where she could breathe without feeling watched. The walls were thin, and at night the muffled bass from the bar below mixed with the hum of the city outside. Sometimes she would wake up to the sound of laughter or breaking glass and remember that she was free, though freedom came with its own kind of loneliness. The landlord didn't ask many questions when she paid in cash, which was good because she never had much to give. Most of her savings were gone after the move, and she lived from one paycheck to the next, measuring milk by the ounce and sleep by the hour. Her days were long and exhausting. She found a job in a small diner 3 blocks away, serving coffee to people who never looked her in the eye. The manager, a woman named Grace with a smoker's voice and kind heart, hired her on the spot after seeing how carefully she held Lily on her hip during the interview. Sophia worked double shifts when she could, sometimes leaving Lily with a neighbor's teenage daughter for a few dollars a day. Every night she returned home smelling of grease and coffee grounds, her hands raw from scrubbing dishes, but when she saw her daughter's sleepy smile, she forgot how tired she was. After putting Lily to bed, Sophia would sit at the wobbly table and draw. The light from the single lamp cast deep shadows on her sketchbook as she filled page after page with whimsical characters, small foxes in scarves, stars that danced, and little girls who climbed ladders into the sky. She drew not for money at first, but for sanity, to remember that she was still someone capable of creating beauty in a life that had turned gray. It was her way of whispering to herself that she hadn't vanished. Weeks passed, then months. The city around her began to change with the seasons. The air grew colder, the nights longer, and the first snow settled on the cracked window frame. One evening, while cleaning up spilled soup at the diner, she overheard two customers talking about a children's book competition hosted by a large publishing company downtown. The grand prize was small, but it came with a contract and the chance to be seen. She went home that night with the idea burning in her mind. For hours, she stared at her sketches, doubting herself, then choosing one illustration and redrawing it until the dawn light crept through the curtains. When the morning came, she sent her submission online from a borrowed laptop, her heart pounding as if she had just taken a leap off a cliff. The days that followed were ordinary and heavy. She forgot about the contest and focused on survival. The diner was busier than usual during the holiday rush, and she spent her shift smiling at strangers and pretending not to notice when they complained. Lily came down with a fever one night, and Sophia spent hours rocking her in the dark, whispering lullabies she barely remembered. She felt stretched thin, like a thread about to snap, but she never allowed herself to cry in front of her daughter. One quiet Sunday morning, as she was folding laundry, her phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Congratulations." At first, she thought it was spam, but then she saw the name of the publishing house. Her hands began to shake. The message was short, polite, almost formal, but its meaning was everything. They loved her work. They wanted to purchase her illustrations for a new children's series. They wanted to meet. Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, the screen lighting her face, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. She looked over at Lily, who was stacking wooden blocks on the floor, humming to herself, unaware that their lives had just shifted. In that fragile moment, Sophia felt something she hadn't felt since she walked away from Ethan's mansion, hope, real and bright, rising quietly inside her chest. She didn't know it yet, but that single email would be the first thread of a new tapestry, one she would weave from resilience, love, and every piece of herself she had refused to let die. The office of the publishing house was nothing like Sophia had imagined. It wasn't grand or intimidating, but bright and filled with color. Illustrations lined the walls, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. She sat nervously in the waiting area, holding a portfolio that looked worn from years of use. Her palms were damp, her heart unsteady, but she tried to remind herself that she belonged there now. When the editor finally appeared, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, he smiled as though he had already decided she was one of them. He told her he had shown her drawings to the team, that they loved her soft style and how her characters seemed alive, as if each had a secret they were about to tell. For the first time in years, someone saw her not as a tired waitress or a single mother, but as an artist. The payment for her first project was small, barely enough to cover rent for 2 months, yet it felt like a fortune. She used some of it to buy new brushes and colored pencils, and the rest she saved carefully in a small envelope tucked between the pages of her sketchbook. Each night after putting Lily to bed, she worked at the table by the window, creating new worlds while the noise of the city faded below. Sometimes she would look out at the lights and imagine Ethan in one of those distant offices, surrounded by success, unaware that she was quietly rebuilding her life piece by piece. But she no longer drew from pain, she drew from the fragile joy that came from surviving. As the months passed, more opportunities came. Her first book was published under the name S. Carter, a simple signature that carried both protection and mystery. The editors liked it, believing it added an air of intrigue, but for Sophia, it was a small act of defiance. It allowed her to exist without the shadow of her past, to create a world where she could stand on her own. When she saw her illustrations printed for the first time, bound and glossy in a children's book, she cried quietly at her kitchen table, the smell of coffee mingling with tears. It wasn't fame or wealth that moved her, it was proof that she could make something beautiful after everything had fallen apart. Letters began arriving from parents who said their children loved her drawings, from teachers who used her books in class. Each note felt like a piece of her old self being returned. She framed the first one, written in a child's uneven handwriting, and placed it on the wall above her desk. Lily would sometimes sit beside her, scribbling her own little drawings, and Sophia would watch her daughter's concentration with a tenderness that felt almost holy. She wanted Lily to grow up believing that strength didn't mean perfection, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was start again. There were still hard days. The bills didn't stop coming, and there were moments when loneliness crept in like an old ghost. But she had learned to live with it, to turn that ache into something gentle and useful. On those nights, when she couldn't sleep, she drew until her hands ached and her heart quieted. Her art began to change subtly, reflecting not only struggle but also light, an understanding that darkness could make beauty sharper, more honest. By the end of that year, Sophia had illustrated 3 books and was invited to collaborate on a 4th. Her editor called her a rising star, though she still lived in the same small apartment, cooked simple meals, and walked Lily to the park on her days off. Yet when she watched her daughter run across the playground, hair catching the sunlight, she knew she had already won something much greater than recognition. She had built a life from nothing, shaped it with ink, paper, and quiet determination. What she didn't know was that across the city, Ethan was beginning to lose his empire, the same empire he once chose over her. Their paths were moving again, though neither of them yet understood that destiny was drawing a slow, deliberate circle that would one day bring them face to face once more. Ethan Miller's world began to crumble long before he realized it. At first, the signs were subtle, numbers that didn't add up, small discrepancies in the company's accounts, meetings that ended with forced smiles and vague reassurances. His partner, a man he had once called his closest friend, started avoiding eye contact, always too busy, always out of town. Ethan, too proud and too tired, chose to believe that everything was under control. For years he had built his success on confidence, on the illusion that he could bend the world to his will, and now that illusion blinded him. The empire he had constructed with relentless precision began to shake from within, and by the time he finally noticed, it was already too late. The betrayal came quietly, like a knife slipped between the ribs. One morning, he arrived at the office to find his access revoked, his name removed from the board, and a letter waiting on his desk explaining that his shares had been transferred without his knowledge. Legal battles followed, brutal and public, and the media devoured every detail of his downfall. The man once celebrated on magazine covers became a cautionary tale, a symbol of arrogance and greed. Friends who had toasted his success stopped answering his calls, and investors who once begged for his attention now avoided him in public. He tried to fight back, but the foundation of his empire had been rotten for years, and his fury only made the collapse faster. When the final verdict came and the company was lost, Ethan stood in the courtroom staring at the floor, feeling a silence heavier than any noise he had ever known. He had thought money was power, but in that moment, stripped of everything, he realized it had only been armor. Without it, he didn't know who he was. He sold the mansion, the cars, the yacht he barely used. Each sale felt like tearing away another piece of himself, yet part of him felt strangely relieved. There was nothing left to prove. What he hadn't expected was how empty the quiet could be once the applause was gone. He moved into a smaller apartment overlooking the river, the kind of place he would have once called humble, almost laughable, but it was the first home he had ever truly lived in alone. The city looked different from there. Without assistants and chauffeurs, he walked among ordinary people and saw things he had never noticed before, the exhaustion in a waitress's smile, the way parents carried their sleeping children on late-night trains, the quiet dignity in those who had nothing to boast about. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of a woman on the street who reminded him of Sophia, and his chest would tighten with something that wasn't quite regret and not yet forgiveness. At night, when sleep refused to come, he would pour a glass of whiskey and sit by the window, remembering her face the day he told her to leave. He had been so certain then, so sure that love was a distraction and independence meant strength. But in the silence of that apartment, he began to see the truth he had buried under ambition. Sophia had not been his weakness, she had been the only part of him that was real. The memory of her standing still while he shouted, her calm eyes refusing to mirror his anger, haunted him. He wondered where she was now, if she had found peace or if she still hated him. The thought of her struggling somewhere cut deeper than he expected, and yet, he didn't have the courage to look for her. He believed he didn't deserve to. Time moved slowly. He took odd consulting jobs to stay afloat, though the once golden name Ethan Miller no longer opened doors. Occasionally, he would see his reflection in the glass of an office building, blonde hair slightly grayer, blue eyes dulled but searching, and hardly recognize himself. The city that had once bowed to him now passed him by without a glance. Still, there was a strange comfort in that anonymity, as if he was being stripped down to something pure. He began to read again, books he had never had time for, and on weekends he volunteered at a community center, teaching business basics to young entrepreneurs who reminded him of himself before pride consumed him. One evening, after a long day at the center, he walked home along the river. The sun was setting, painting the water gold, and for the first time in years, he felt a quiet sense of surrender. The world no longer owed him anything, and he no longer needed to prove his worth. Somewhere far away, Sophia was living a life without him, and though it hurt, the thought brought him peace. What he didn't know was that her success was beginning to ripple through the same city that had buried him, and that soon, their paths would cross again, not as enemies, not as the people they had once been, but as two souls reshaped by loss, walking unknowingly toward redemption. The morning of the flight felt strangely calm. The sky over New York was pale and washed in a thin mist that blurred the edges of the skyline, and the city moved as if half awake. Sophia stood at the airport gate with Lily's small hand clasped in hers, the two of them surrounded by the hum of travelers, rolling suitcases, and half-finished coffees. She had been invited to Los Angeles for the International Children's Literature Awards, where her book, The Moon Child, had been nominated for Best Illustrated Story of the Year. She hadn't believed it at first, she had stared at the email for nearly an hour before accepting that it was real. Even now, as she handed the tickets to the attendant, she still felt like someone was about to tap her on the shoulder and tell her it was all a mistake. Lily, too young to understand the weight of the occasion, was delighted just to be flying for the first time. She wore a pink sweater with little stars and carried her beloved plush bunny under one arm, chatting happily about clouds and window seats. Ethan boarded the same flight without noticing them. He was traveling for business, or at least what was left of it. After years of rebuilding from the ashes of his ruined empire, he had managed to find small footing as a consultant, quietly advising startups and mid-level companies. It was not the glory of his past life, but it was honest work, and for the first time, he found satisfaction in effort rather than control. He sat in the business class section, tired but at peace, with a newspaper folded neatly beside a cup of black coffee. The world had stopped writing about him, which he considered a blessing. He had no expectations for the future, only the quiet wish that someday he might make peace with the mistakes that still haunted his sleep. When Sophia stepped into the cabin, balancing her carry-on and helping Lily find their seats, she barely glanced around. She was focused on keeping the child settled and stowing her sketchbook under the seat. Yet as she straightened up, her gaze brushed across a familiar figure in the next aisle, and her heart stopped for a beat. The blonde hair, the sharp line of the shoulders, the stillness she remembered too well, it was Ethan. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed that it couldn't be him, that life wasn't cruel enough to orchestrate such a meeting after 3 years of silence. But when he turned his head slightly toward the window, she saw his profile, older, thinner, and touched by fatigue. It was him, and the reality of it hit her with a mixture of shock and something she couldn't name. She quickly looked away, pretending to adjust Lily's seatbelt. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced a steady smile for her daughter, who was now gazing in awe at the flight attendants. Sophia's thoughts spiraled, memories she had buried beneath layers of time came rushing back. The day he told her to leave. The nights she cried herself to sleep in that tiny apartment. The years of struggle that had followed. And yet, beneath all of that pain, there was something else too, a deep, distant ache of what they once were before everything fell apart. Ethan didn't notice her at first. He was absorbed in his own thoughts, watching the runway through the window. It wasn't until the flight was in the air, when he stood to reach for a folder from the overhead bin, that his eyes fell on her. The world seemed to tilt. For a second, he thought he was imagining things. He froze, his hand still gripping the compartment handle. She was sitting 3 rows ahead, turned slightly toward the window, her dark hair tucked behind one ear, her face calm but distant. And next to her sat a little girl, legs swinging, whispering to a stuffed rabbit. He stared, trying to process what his heart already knew. Sophia looked up then, and their eyes met. The moment stretched, wordless and unbearable. In her gaze, he saw not accusation, not hatred, but a quiet strength that unsettled him. She had changed. The woman sitting there was no longer the one he had left behind, she was someone rebuilt from pain, composed of grace and fire in equal measure. He felt suddenly small in the shadow of what he had done. When the flight attendants dimmed the lights and served lunch, he hesitated for a long time before walking down the aisle toward her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was careful and low. Sophia. Her name tasted foreign in his mouth, like something he hadn't earned the right to say. She turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. Ethan. That was all. No smile, no bitterness, just acknowledgement. Lily, curious, looked up at the stranger, then returned to coloring in her book. He asked if he could sit beside her for a moment, and she nodded. They spoke quietly, their words cautious and deliberate. He told her he had heard about her success, that her book had reached even the circles he still moved in. She thanked him, her tone polite but distant. When he tried to apologize, she didn't interrupt. She listened. And when he finished, there was a long silence before she said softly, "I don't hate you anymore. I used to, for a long time. But then I realized that hate keeps you tied to the past, and I needed to be free." Her calmness disarmed him more than anger ever could. He looked at Lily, realizing she must be 3 or 4 years old now, and his throat tightened. The child had his eyes, that clear blue that had once been his pride. He wanted to ask questions, but he didn't dare. The answers were written plainly in the years he had missed. When the plane began to descend, he thanked her for speaking with him. She simply nodded again, and for a moment, they both looked out the window at the clouds parting over the Pacific. The light poured into the cabin, soft and gold, and Ethan felt a strange warmth stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. Maybe it was hope, small and fragile, the kind that doesn't announce itself but waits quietly for the right time. As they landed, the passengers gathered their things. Lily tugged at Sophia's sleeve and whispered something about wanting to see the ocean. Sophia smiled at her daughter, and Ethan watched that simple exchange with an ache that went deeper than regret. When they stepped into the terminal, he expected her to disappear into the crowd, as she had years before. But this time, she turned back for a moment and met his eyes once more. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said softly, and then she was gone, her daughter's laughter echoing through the noise of the airport. He stood there for a long time, feeling something inside him shift, not the sharp pain of loss, but the quiet beginning of something that might one day become forgiveness. The next morning in Los Angeles was filled with a soft haze that made everything seem distant and unreal, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The hotel where the award nominees stayed was elegant in an understated way, with tall glass windows overlooking the ocean and the constant hum of waves breaking in the distance. Sophia woke early, unable to sleep after the flight. Lily was still curled up under the blanket, her small hand gripping the ear of her stuffed rabbit, breathing evenly in the rhythm of peaceful dreams. Sophia stood by the window, her reflection faint in the glass, watching the faint streaks of light dissolve over the Pacific. Her mind was still tangled in the memory of the flight, the sudden reappearance of Ethan, the way his voice had sounded when he said her name. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed what she would say if they ever met again, yet when it finally happened, her heart had simply stood still. She told herself that the past was buried and that the only thing that mattered now was the future, the awards, her art, her daughter. But Ethan's face, older and marked by something she couldn't define, kept pushing through the thoughts she tried to silence. He had looked lost, humbled, almost fragile, and that image unsettled her more than the memory of his cruelty ever had. It wasn't the man who shouted at her years ago, it was someone stripped bare, someone who had learned what it meant to fall. Later that morning, she dressed Lily and they went down to the breakfast hall. The tables were crowded with authors, editors, and illustrators. People smiled at her, some recognizing her name tag, others greeting her as if they had known her for years through her work. She felt awkward in the sudden warmth of attention but grateful too. As she poured juice for Lily, a familiar voice behind her made her freeze for a heartbeat before she turned. Ethan stood there, holding a cup of coffee, uncertain whether to smile or walk away. He seemed hesitant, as if afraid that speaking again might shatter something delicate. "Good morning," he said quietly, and she nodded, her tone neutral but not cold. "Good morning." He gestured to the empty seat across from her, and after a moment, she motioned for him to sit. The conversation began clumsily. He asked about Lily, about her work, about how long she had been drawing professionally. Sophia answered simply, avoiding any trace of nostalgia. Yet as they talked, the tension began to ease, replaced by something softer and strangely peaceful. It was as though time had sanded the sharp edges off their pain, leaving only the truth beneath it. He told her what had happened after their separation, not in self-pity but with honesty. The betrayal by his partner, the collapse of his company, the years spent trying to understand who he was without money or status. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability behind the mask of control he had once worn so tightly. When he finished, there was silence between them, the kind that feels heavy but not uncomfortable. Sophia looked at him and said, almost gently, "You had everything you thought mattered. I had nothing. Maybe we both needed to lose what we loved to find out who we really were." He nodded, unable to speak. There was no defense left in him, no pride. Just gratitude that she was willing to sit there and talk it all. He wanted to apologize again, to make her understand how much he regretted his arrogance, but she stopped him with a quiet smile. "I forgave you long ago," she said. "Not for you, but for me. I couldn't carry that anger forever." They spent the rest of the morning walking outside with Lily, who ran ahead chasing the birds near the edge of the water. The sun had burned through the haze by then, and the beach shimmered with gold and blue. Watching Sophia laugh with her daughter, Ethan felt something break open inside him, a tenderness he thought had long since died. He realized that what he had mistaken for strength in his old life had been fear all along, and that true strength was this woman before him, who had survived the wreckage he caused and learned to shine again. As the afternoon faded, they sat together on a bench overlooking the ocean while Lily built small sand towers nearby. Neither of them spoke much. The silence carried more meaning than words could. When Sophia finally stood to leave, Ethan didn't try to stop her. He simply said, "You deserve everything you've built. I'm proud of you." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes soft, and replied, "Maybe we both deserved a second chance, just not with each other, not yet." That night, as Sophia tucked Lily into bed, she felt lighter than she had in years. Forgiveness had not erased the past, but it had changed its color, turning the pain into something distant and almost peaceful. Across the city, in his quiet hotel room, Ethan sat by the window staring at the ocean's dark horizon. For the first time since the fall of his empire, he felt something close to peace. Their paths had crossed again, not to reopen old wounds, but to remind them both that sometimes redemption begins with a single conversation above the clouds. In the months that followed their unexpected meeting, life seemed to unfold with a quiet rhythm neither of them had known before. Sophia returned to New York filled with a new sense of calm, as though some invisible knot inside her had finally loosened. The confrontation she had dreaded for years had come and gone without destruction, leaving behind only a bittersweet clarity. She threw herself back into her work, finishing another illustrated book that explored light and rebirth, stories that mirrored her own journey more than she cared to admit. Her publishers were delighted, her name began to appear in interviews, and for the first time, she could afford not to worry about the next rent payment. She found a larger apartment with an art studio filled with natural light, and Lily had her own little corner covered in crayons and papers. Yet even with success blooming around her, she found herself thinking of Ethan from time to time, not with anger or longing, but with a quiet curiosity about how he was finding his way in the world now. Ethan, meanwhile, had changed his pace completely. The man who once spent his days chasing meetings and his nights chasing deals began volunteering more often at the community center where he taught young people about business. He no longer spoke in the language of profits and risks, but in the language of growth and responsibility. The fall of his company had stripped him bare, and in its place he had discovered something like humility. It wasn't easy, he lived simply, ate modestly, and often walked instead of driving, but he felt more alive than he ever had surrounded by luxury. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would scroll through news articles and stumble upon mentions of Sophia's work, her photographs at book fairs, her interviews about motherhood and creativity. Each time, a small smile would appear on his face. It wasn't jealousy, only pride that she had found her place in a world that once seemed intent on breaking her. Months turned into a year, and by a coincidence that felt almost fated, their paths crossed again through the Children's Art Foundation Sophia had founded with her publisher's support. The foundation offered scholarships to underprivileged children with artistic potential, providing them with tools, mentorship, and a space to dream. When Sophia learned that Ethan had been volunteering at the same community center where many of those children came from, she reached out to him, not out of sentiment, but because she needed help managing the financial aspects of the program. Their first meeting was awkward but polite. They discussed budgets and grants, the cost of supplies, and logistics for workshops. He treated her with quiet respect, never overstepping, and she realized that the arrogance she once despised had been replaced by patience. Working together brought a different kind of intimacy, one built on trust rather than emotion. They would meet in the foundation's small office late in the evenings after classes, their conversations blending practical details with moments of reflection. She would tell him about the children's progress, their laughter and stubbornness, and he would listen with genuine warmth, sometimes staying late to help set up tables or paint shelves. One night, as they locked up, Sophia turned to him and said softly, "You're good with them. They trust you." He looked at her, surprised, and said, "Maybe because I finally learned how to listen." That simple exchange hung between them, gentle and unspoken, a recognition that both had grown in ways neither could have imagined. Sophia still guarded her heart carefully. She didn't want to blur the fragile peace they had rebuilt, but she couldn't deny that being around him no longer hurt. They shared coffee sometimes after classes, talking about books, about Lily's drawings, about the strange turns of fate that had brought them here. Lily adored him in an innocent way, unaware of their history, calling him Mr. Ethan and showing him her sketches with unfiltered pride. He would kneel beside her, giving thoughtful advice, and each time Sophia watched them together, she felt a quiet ache of gratitude. There was no grand declaration between them, no sweeping gestures. What grew instead was something steady and human, an understanding that forgiveness had made space for friendship, and perhaps, one day, something more. The city moved around them as seasons changed, and by the second winter, their foundation had helped dozens of children publish their own small illustrated book. At the celebration, surrounded by laughter and color, Sophia looked across the room at Ethan. Their eyes met, and he smiled, not with expectation but with peace. She returned the smile, realizing that love, when it finally returned, didn't need to arrive like a storm. It could come quietly, through shared work, small kindnesses, and the simple act of staying when it would have been easier to leave. That night, as snow began to fall outside, Sophia walked home with Lily asleep in her arms, the world soft and glowing. She thought about everything that had brought her here, the pain, the loss, the rebuilding, and understood that life had not broken her, it had remade her. Somewhere across the city, Ethan watched the same snowfall from his window and felt the same quiet certainty that their story, once shattered, was slowly finding its way back toward light. 2 years later, the world felt softer, as if time itself had been kind enough to forgive what once seemed unforgivable. The foundation had grown beyond anything Sophia ever imagined. The small studio that had started with only a handful of children now thrived as a full-fledged center for young artists, its walls alive with color and laughter. Her name had become well known in the publishing world, and her books were translated into several languages, yet she carried her success lightly. The apartment she once rented above the noisy bar was long gone, replaced by a quiet home near the ocean, where the air smelled of salt and pine and the mornings began with the sound of waves against the shore. It wasn't a mansion, but it was beautiful in the way things are when they are built out of love instead of pride. On most evenings, when her work was done, Sophia sat on the veranda sketching while Lily, now 5, ran barefoot in the garden, chasing butterflies and inventing stories for the flowers. The house was filled with small details that reflected the life they had made, sketches framed along the hallway, shelves stacked with children's books, a piano that she still didn't know how to play but loved having around just for the sound of it. Peace had become her quiet companion. There were still moments of fear, moments when she would wake in the night from dreams of the past, but they no longer controlled her. They were reminders of how far she had come. Ethan was part of that life now, not as the man who had once broken her, but as someone reborn beside her. The years after their reunion had not been rushed or romantic in the dramatic sense, they had been slow, patient, and filled with effort. He had moved to the coast a year after she did, quietly at first, helping the foundation expand its programs in nearby schools. His presence was steady and calm, and though they never labeled what grew between them, there was a familiarity that went deeper than love stories told in films. They understood each other's silences. They didn't need apologies anymore, only the small daily gestures that spoke louder, his habit of fixing the squeaky door, her way of leaving a cup of coffee for him on the porch when he arrived early to help with the garden. Lily adored him completely. To her, Ethan was not the man from stories of the past, but simply someone who cared, who taught her how to fly a kite, who showed her how to skip stones, who listened to her stories as if each one were important. Sometimes Sophia would watch them together, feeling the warmth of a love that had come full circle in the most unexpected way. Ethan never tried to replace the years he had missed, never forced his place in their lives, but over time, his quiet presence became part of their home, as natural as the rhythm of the tides. One autumn evening, the three of them sat outside watching the sunset. The sky burned in shades of amber and rose, and the light reflected off the water like molten glass. Lily was drawing in chalk across the wooden planks of the veranda, creating stars and hearts that glowed faintly in the fading light. Ethan poured coffee for Sophia, his movements slow and unhurried, and she smiled at how gentle he had become. It was strange to think how fierce and closed he had once been, how he had believed that control was the same as strength. Now he moved through the world with ease, unafraid to be vulnerable. They talked quietly, about nothing and everything, her new book that she wasn't sure she had the energy to finish, the children at the foundation, the small storms of daily life that made up their days. As the sky deepened into twilight, Sophia turned to him and said, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't lost everything?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Sometimes, he admitted, but then I realize we would have never learned how to really live. We would have had everything except what matters. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the last shimmer of light on the horizon. It wasn't sadness she felt, but gratitude, for the pain that had taught her resilience, for the distance that had allowed them both to grow, for the strange and miraculous way life had brought them back together without bitterness. When Lily finally fell asleep in her mother's lap, Ethan carried her inside, placing her gently in bed before returning to the veranda. Sophia sat with her knees drawn up, watching the stars appear one by one. The air was cool and filled with the scent of the sea. He sat beside her, and for a while they didn't speak. Then, softly, he said, "I used to think love was something you conquer. I was wrong. It's something you build, slowly, every day." She smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if you stop building it?" He looked out at the waves and replied, "Then you start again. That's what makes it real." They sat there until the moon rose high, the world around them quiet except for the sound of the ocean breathing against the shore. Sophia rested her head on his shoulder, not out of weakness but out of peace. She realized then that the story of her life had never been about loss or revenge or even forgiveness, it had been about becoming whole. The man beside her, the child sleeping inside, the house filled with laughter and dreams, this was not the ending she had once imagined when she walked away years ago. It was better, softer, honest. It was the kind of ending that didn't feel like one at all, because it was only the beginning of a new chapter, one built not from wealth or power, but from understanding, courage, and the quiet grace of love rediscovered.